everybody, my name is Karla from Written Word Calligraphy, and I'm so excited that you are here. Today you are going to learn all about how to flat lay pieces like stationery, for example, or other things that look great flat, and learn about how to style them properly with the right lighting, with the right props, and how to make it look good. Also, I'm really excited that you are here for the summer workshop retreat where you can learn from 100 other calligraphers, letterers, artists, and it's just so fun to be here with you. So first, let me tell you a little bit about myself. So I am the owner of Written Word Calligraphy, which is a wedding invitation design studio / calligraphy academy. So I also do teach a lot of online courses such as how to start out in modern calligraphy, how to develop your own style, so that's more of an intermediate class, and then into invitation design, so all of the graphic design skills you need in order to start a calligraphy business, and then the Calligraphy Business Kickstarter, which is a course specifically for calligraphers, a business course specifically for calligraphers. In order to take this particular class, I want you to download the lighting and equipment guide that has everything you'll need. So I'll be putting it in the links, and that way you can download that as well. So the goal of today's course is for you to learn the basics of beautiful flat lays, which are photos essentially that are taken top down. So there's a couple of tips and tricks that I've learned over the years, especially taking photos of lots of my wedding invitations, and I'd love to share them all about you. So there are 3 L's I want you to learn in this course. So the first one has to do with lighting. So first L is lighting, because lighting is so important regarding to taking photos of your items, especially when you're shooting it top down. You would like to think that it's, fairly easy, but no, actually there's a lot of different elements to lighting that you'll need to think about, such as, the source of light, where the shadows are, the time of day that you're shooting in, and all of that kind of stuff. And the second L is layout. So you're going to learn about the different tips and tricks of a beautiful flat lay, like how to lay things out, how many pieces need to be in there, and also how to make a balanced look, essentially, because flat lays are a rather complicated piece. It's almost like posing people for a really large portrait with lots of people, and you kind of need to put everything in the right place. That way it doesn't get too busy, and also you kind of have the same focus for everything. And of course, with any kind of photography, you also want the photo to be effective as well. So if the photo is not in focus, or things are crooked and things like that, it just doesn't make a good photo. So you'll learn all about layout. And you'll also learn some of the technical aspects to making a good flat lay photo, such as leverage. So, some things that talk about, for example, the right angles, the right heights for the pieces, varying them, how to position yourself so everything is level. Those are the different things you'll get to learn in this course. But first of all, let's talk about what in the world is flat lay styling. I know you probably have a general sense of what it is, but in essence, what flat lay photography is setting up the items on a flat surface, sometimes on a table or on the floor, and you will be laying them out so that it looks cohesive from the top down. So that's essentially what flat lays are. Styling them, of course, means that you're arranging it so that it's got a beautiful aesthetic once you've photographed everything. And for today's particular workshop, we're actually going to be learning how to photograph it using just our mobile device. I personally do shoot with a DSLR camera, but every now and then, you're just trying to capture a good flat lay, you can certainly use your mobile device. These days, our cameras are so good already, and you can edit directly on your phone. It's just really cool to have that flexibility, essentially. So what is flat lay styling for? Primarily, it is for flat items. So for example, stationery, that's what we're going to be photographing today, because that's what I usually photograph for flat lays. But of course, there's certain items as well that look better when it's laid flat. So for example, Like some kinds of jewelry look good in this way. Books generally look good. Anything flat, essentially. Bags, for example, don't look as good when you're flat laying them, unless, of course, you're kind of trying to make that look, or like a wallet would look better than a 3D bag. Like, so anything that has a good flat surface to it, like a 2D effect to it, then that's usually a good place to start off with regard to your flat lay pieces. So, pieces of paper, pens, inks, essentially things that you would use as a calligrapher or letterer. I'm sure you'll end up doing some kind of flat lay as an artist. And so some tips I wanted to share before we even get started with, the materials and the lighting and layouts and all that kind of fun stuff is regarding to planning. So whenever you're doing flat lays, it actually is important to plan out, who these photos are for, what the goal of the photos are, like what the focus is. Typically when I'm taking photos of stationery, I'm trying to show off, the design of the full suite and things like that. So I'd like to be able to plan like a shoot list essentially of what I need and what kind of angles I'll also need. They also want to think about like the horizontal versus vertical orientation, because when you photograph for a horizontal orientation, it's not just simply like twisting your camera around and that's already great for vertical. No, actually, you pretty much you pose that photo specifically for a horizontal orientation. It's different. You have to kind of move things around for a vertical orientation for it to look nice and cohesive together. Sometimes I even recommend my students to sketch out some possible layouts. You can sketch them on a piece of paper, or you can do a mock-up of it on your computer as well if you're well versed with the graphic design programs. That way you can kind of get a general sense of what you need in order to get your flat lays like really good by the time you actually do them. All right, are you guys ready? We're going to talk about materials next. So now let's talk about the materials you need for a good flat lay. First has to do with lighting. Usually that one's fairly easy. Almost all of us have a window in our house, so that gives you some good natural light. Or of course you can also invest in some studio lighting, especially if you're doing a lot of product photography, because natural lighting does change a lot over the day, or even the direction of the sunlight can change, or if it's sunny or not. So having some studio lighting is always good. I personally have just one light box that has a boom stand, and that way I can have the light directly down or have it angled so that it reflects kind of like a sun. And it's great for products because it's usually just for a smaller piece. One light box is great for that. Like when you get into bigger things like photographing people or like taking a very big set, then you'll definitely need more than one light. Backdrops are very, very important for photographing flat lays. As you can see here, I've got so many different kinds. This one is from Layout Collection, and this one's got like kind of like a velvet suede feel to it. It comes in 2 colors. These are rollable. Most of these backdrops are also like rollable. That way they're usually made for photographers to bring during weddings and things like that. So I love them because I could kind of roll them away as well. This one, they no longer make these ones, but it's a really cool piece that looks like plaster. So if you like having some texture in your flat lace or making it look like some kind of cool flooring, that's another way to go about it. You can certainly DIY this piece. Regular white or like colored sheets that are at least 20 by 30 inches are also good for taking photos, just like this one, for example. This is called Stonehenge paper from Legion Paper. You can get this one, at your local art store, or you can order it online, and they're like fairly inexpensive, a couple dollars each, and they have like a nice uncoated texture, which is usually good for taking photos. When you take photos with the backdrop, you want it to be not reflective. That way the light doesn't shine back on you, unless of course like that's kind of the intention. So for example, sometimes I photograph with like a marble table. That piece is more reflective. The downside of reflection is that you can see yourself in it really sometimes. So that's probably why I stay away from marbles backgrounds, but it is a really good background as well. This one is from Locust Collection. This one's a seamless background that is a fabric piece. I really love this one in particular because it's just so versatile and it's so huge. Sometimes when I'm shooting more 3D items, it's nice to have something bigger. So this one is great because it's also foldable. And When it's like a fabric material like this that's thick enough, then it won't be as wrinkly, because typically whenever I have, say, like a piece of linen or cotton, they tend to roll and like have wrinkles, and having wrinkles, unless it's super intentional, doesn't look that great. This one is also, this one's from Chasing Stone, so it's got like a more textured surface, which I also really like. It's cool. It almost, you know, reminds me of like an old world look and feel for like a wall. So these are some of the backdrops I personally use. And then of course there's like props as well. So I've got lots, I collect them over the years, and I have them for like different look and feels as well. So for example, I have these vintage stamps for a more vintage look, right? Like for example, like this piece here, I got these ones from eBay, or Signora A. Murray. She also has like all these little cool pieces, you know, vintage letters. Like I love finding like little cool holders for stuff. Like this, for example, just because they add so much character. You can never go wrong with having some ribbons as well, little bowls and plates, like anything small essentially are good for props, especially for taking photos, like for these, like wax seals. Also want to consider having some kind of ring box, you know, if you want to photograph wedding invitations, for example, that kind of relates the whole piece. And then of course the lifters. So lifters, you can use lots of different things. Like you can purchase acrylic lifters like these on Etsy, for example. I forgot the name of the store, but I'll put that in the equipment guide. You can use like coasters like this as well, you know, to lift the items up and give them a little bit more of a shadow. I personally use these matchboxes that were from my previous wedding, and it's just because it's got a nice size to it. Most of my invitation pieces are larger than this, so it gives it a good height. And sometimes, if I just don't have enough of things, I just use cards. So my business cards, sometimes I just have so many on hand, but they work as really great stackers because I can manage the height very well and easily, at least, because sometimes you'll need, you know, I think 3 or 2 of these matchboxes, whereas with paper, like you could just stack as many as you need. So that's kind of what you'll need for lifters. And of course, the photography equipment, you know, for this one, we're going to be using a phone to take photos of the items, but you can also, you know, use a DSLR camera. I also really like, you know, using like a reflector sometimes, especially if you are in a space where it's super colorful. My studio is nice and white, so it reflects white onto my products. But say, for example, you have a really painted room, like green or yellow, it will cast yellow or green onto your products, and you don't want to do that. So if in that case, you might need a light box or at least some V-flats, which are really large foam boards or cardboard that you can paint white, or they come white, and then you can use them kind of like making walls around your area to kind of prevent the color cast from happening. And of course, there's also some of these optional materials that will be helpful for you, such as having a level, especially when you're taking photos of a flat lay. You really want it to be level. If it's a little bit off, people might notice it, and sometimes it's a little bit hard to adjust it, even if you can kind of adjust it on Photoshop or Illustrator, Lightroom, but it's just not the same. There are lint rollers. Sometimes, like, you know, if you have a lot of fibers around, you know, when you do flat lays, it's very specific to your surface. So if there's like little bits in dirt and things like that, you want to be able to get that out. So sometimes having a lint roller is good. Tweezers, again, for moving things around. Steamers for like fabric, ribbons, things like that. Glue dots, or like I also like to use that bit of like blue clay. I can't remember what it's called. Blue tack. Oh, there you go. Blue tack, and then that way I could make sure things don't move. Or like envelopes, for example, like the flap sometimes like just keeps wanting to stay open, so I use that to kind of help put things in the right place. Or of course, double-sided tape also works. So those are the types of materials you'll need for a good flat lay. So the first L that you want to learn is about lighting. So I mentioned a little bit about it in the earlier section on the materials, but for this particular workshop, we're going to learn about natural lighting as my source for lighting for the flat lay. So there's many kinds of lighting, but sometimes the natural light, it's just great to have like just one window, and usually that's a really good source of light that you need for your flat lays already. And of course, everybody already has a window in general versus like having studio lighting, not everybody has that. So what you want to consider with regard to natural lighting is the time of day as well as the positioning of your window. So for example, this window I have here is east facing, and at this time, it's currently about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So the sun is closer to the top or almost to the other side of my house. So it's a little bit on the cooler side already. Earlier on the day, this window usually gives me a lot of warm lighting, so you'd want to consider that when you're filming. On the west window, I usually bring my stuff over there to shoot in the afternoon because the lighting is nice and warm. In general, you want to keep the colors between neutral and warm tones when you're shooting for flat lays. It's harder to get rid of blue. In terms of photographing, things tend to look more dull. It's very different. It's similar to kind of how we think about it in real life when we have a photo on a rainy day versus a photo during a sunny day. So that kind of helps you decide, which window you're going to pick for it as well. North windows I generally stay away from because throughout the day you're going to have fairly cool colored lighting, and then in the south windows you have a very warm tone almost throughout the day. It's usually pretty bright, so that's the best situation essentially, is to have a south window. If it gets too late in the afternoon, it might be a little bit too warm, so that you may want to consider shooting it between early morning until about 2 to 3 in the afternoon. Later on, much later in the afternoon, it might be too yellow or like the lights might be too strong for it as well. I also wanted to give you a note on ambient lighting because, that really affects the cast on your item. So for example, right now, it's a little bit on the blue side of lighting here, so it does add a cast to my piece. So when I'm editing, it's a little bit on the harder side versus if I photograph this in the morning where it's a little bit warm. But if my area here was not white, it was like yellow or green or red or purple, it will add other tints essentially into your surface that it's harder to get rid of in post-production, in Photoshop essentially. So you can get yourself some V-flats or reflectors, and that way you can keep this area, nice and neutral tone that is reflective of the color that you're going for. So the next thing I wanted to teach you has to do with the shadows. So the shadows actually play a huge role with regard to your stationary pieces. Like for example, this one I've got a little piece here, my matchbox, I kind of lift it up, and the positioning of the shadows does reflect like a good flat lay. Having some shadows brings the flat lays to life versus having them completely flat like this. It gives them some dimension essentially. It's almost like posing people in real life. Like you don't want them to be all standing in one line. You kind of want some people like a little bit closer or further away just to kind of create that full look and feel essentially. And especially if you have something that's more important than the other things. So that's what the shadows are for. So one thing you want to consider with the shadows essentially is to have them fairly at the bottom right of your piece. So that means that your light will need to come in from here so that your shadows will be at this point. This is the most flattering part for stationery, just like it is for people. If you've probably ever heard of, sometimes a person tells you like, oh, this is not my angle, or like the shadows at the top of, like at noon, the shadows like go right about here, and so people look like they are kind of like raccoon eyes, so it doesn't look very flattering. And that's the same idea here as well. Like you don't want the shadows to be directly at the bottom, which is actually not too terrible, but you don't want it to be at the top in particular. It's similar to having like a flashlight at the bottom of your chin. It makes it look like very unnatural because typically our light is at the top. So when we have the sun, when we see somebody and we're outside, the sun is right on top of us or at the side, and that usually gives us an unnatural shadow to our faces that brings like a person look 3D versus like it's flat. And so sometimes that just means you'll need to adjust your backdrop or adjust the actual pieces in order to create that shadow in the right spot that you want and work from there. So I want you to consider that as well. So in terms of like the most flattering ones, because sometimes you're a little limited based on where you are, the top lights, and then bottom right corner, bottom left also works like this, where it's at the bottom. Right directly at the bottom is okay as well. Side is also okay. So the lighting on the side is okay. What you want to avoid is the shadows like right at the very top. So that's what you want to consider with regard to lighting. And then of course, in terms of equipment for lighting, I sometimes do also have like, you know, the reflectors or the V-flats to help with getting the right cast of color. I usually use my phone or my DSLR camera to take photos of my flat lays or to take videos of me making the flat lays. Those are my usual pieces. I also have a phone stand or like a tripod with a boom, and that way I can get right on top of things. With regard to taking photos of flat lays, you generally want to be like really level. So that means sometimes you need to be like standing. I stand on this table to get the right photo sometimes. But usually, you know, you'll need to have some device in order to take them. And then after that, for post-production, then I also use like Photoshop or Lightroom in order to edit those photos to get them in the right place. And the next one we're going to talk about is layout. So the next thing we're going to learn is all about layout. So with regard to layout, of course, there's a couple of different things that you want to think about when you're doing flat lays, and I'm going to share some of my tips and tricks about that. So in terms of the props, it really depends on the suite or the product that you're photographing. So for this particular suite, this was what I did for my invitation design boot camp. So it's like desert inspired. It's got a lot of like minimal modern textures to it. So I chose this backdrop specifically for that. Like I wanted something that was more modern looking, didn't look too old world, but like that way it reflects the style of the actual invitation itself. And then in terms of props, I am thinking like some of these dried flowers possibly, maybe like some of these little pieces like dried bits, because it kind of reminds me of the desert with like dried cactus and like these like handmade porcelain pieces. Like I wouldn't want to use like say something like this where it's like a gold piece. It's a bit too old world for it. Like I wanted to keep like a more modern feel. So that's how I would choose it as well. And one thing I wanted to remind you also about flat lays is that you don't necessarily have to photograph the suite exactly like how you had created it. You could certainly choose a color palette that matches it the most. So for example, like if you really don't feel like this envelope matches it, you can change it. Change the colors by just adding different envelopes. Like if you can't reprint new things, then just change the color of envelope. It already sets the tone for that. So you want to keep that in mind. And when you have, so for example, this particular suite, you want to take a look at the different pieces that we've got. We've got a main envelope, right? Cool thing about envelopes is that you can photograph them closed like this, or you can have them open. You can have them sideways like this. For example, we can photograph it this way. If you especially if you have an envelope liner, that's usually a cool way of going about it. Like for example, this one is the save the date. I definitely want to show this shape in some way or form, and that you could kind of have it come out this way, for example, and like feature that piece. And you don't always have to have everything at once, because I find that most of people are so excited like styling all the pieces together, but it can get really busy very quickly. So you can always start with say the save the date first and like style that piece first before you style like everything all together. So the first thing we're going to do is to style the save the date. So right now I really like this piece here with the envelope liner, and I also love how this is shaped as a circle. So I'm going to tuck it in so that it's almost like peeking out a little bit and showing a bit of this envelope liner on the side. And then I'm also going to add this matchbox at the bottom, kind of give it a little bit of a lift. And now that I've kind of seen this, I can bring up my phone, my device, to take a photo of it. So the good thing about this layout is that with the phone, you can kind of clearly see where it is. Sometimes on that small viewfinder, you won't be able to see it on the camera. So it's always good to kind of be able to see it in this manner, and that way you can adjust it. So for example, right now, the shadows are at the side. To make it more flattering, you might need to like twist it a little bit on the side. And so in general as well, when you're taking photos of your items, like there's certain flattering angles to it. So for example, like if you take your photos like this, not flattering for photos for stationery or flat lays. You want it to be directly level or at the side. So you're almost like you're playing around with this angle versus you're doing like this kind of angle to it. You want to keep it like more straight on more than anything. And that way you can have it is really a flat lay photo. Of course, you can go in and do some details. For example, like this, you can you know, zoom in a little bit and show like the foil printing. It's foil printing on this particular piece, and kind of see it from all around. But it's a lot easier for you to kind of get that working versus like having it, or you want to keep it like level versus like these angles right here. It's like generally not flattering for stationery itself. And then now, if we want to consider having different pieces, say we want to keep this kind of in the same format, what we want to do is add in some lift. So with the envelope being this way, sometimes it's better if you have a bigger piece, and you can twist this on the side like this, and then add one more envelope there. I think I'm going to get rid of this velvet piece. I don't know if I love it for this particular look. And then kind of make sure you've got your things settled. I mean, once you bring out your phone later, you can kind of see where things are and if it still makes sense or not. And yeah, so actually I'm going to take the save the date out first because I realize I have lots of other pieces still and I want to shoot it without that piece first. So we're going to play around with this layout like this, for example. I've got a couple of long pieces here, this piece. So this piece will need to be on this side. Might need two matchboxes. And you want to make sure that you don't show the matchboxes while you're doing it. And maybe this piece would be cool sideways. So we'll have this sideways. And then it might not be a bad idea to add in some dried florals. So I'm going to add this kind of dried flower at the bottom here. And so I'm currently essentially looking at like a flow to the different pieces. So generally you want to keep things at an odd number. So earlier I photographed like one group of things, which is, you know, the invite and the envelope together, right? So it's only like one piece essentially. And now we've got multiple things. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you kind of want to keep them in like an odd number versus like a grid that has different pieces in it that kind of looks more like even. And now, so you general thought to have that kind of element, and you don't also want them to be like too grouped. Like you kind of want to give them some space. So for example, like there's spacing in here, like you don't want this like too close this way. If there's like about this much room here, you want to keep the same amount of room here. So that means I may need to adjust this piece a little bit further away and kind of adjust it from there. And of course, like making sure that you have a bit of like the 90-degree angles if you're doing something like a grid like this. And then of course, like not having anything crooked, because that's definitely not fun. And so now I'm going to use my mobile device to kind of look and see where I am. Sometimes I can't see it from my angle here because it's still slanted this way. Whereas if I'm on the top with this, I can tell, like for example, we can still adjust this part a little bit, bring it down, and that way I can photograph it. And I add like different elements to it. You can take photos of it straight on like this, or you can do like different corners. So for example, like this reply card, like this section here, like different groups of things essentially, to kind of bring in the overall look. And especially with regard to styling, I'm more of a minimalist. I like having less styling props rather than having too many. And I also want to take a look at the flow too. So in this particular piece, the one that's highest in terms of the hierarchy is actually this particular invite here, because that's the main invitation. It's got the most character to it, so that's the reason why it's also lifted a little bit higher. So this is actually a lot more about leverage, which is the next section here, but I'll also style something else so that I can show you kind of like the idea of like the flow of things. You know, this card, this is an info card, not so important, so it's okay to put it on the side. And of course, once you've kind of done with like a flat image, you can start tilting things. So when you have things crooked, it's okay to have things crooked, just make sure that everything else is crooked as well. The last thing you want is to have multiple things and then not everything is crooked, or it doesn't look intentional. And that's when it hurts our eyes, essentially. Let me add in here maybe some vintage stamps, if I could find any that kind of matches this look. Like maybe just like a simple, you know, black and white one like that, for example. It's like a palm tree. Actually, you know what? Maybe it doesn't need it. Let's just keep it simple. Maybe we'll add a wax seal sample here. Flower dust is also a fun way to kind of add character to the whole piece. So you can add that. So, sorry, still adjusting it. And when you're doing things like on a crooked side, it's also okay to have some symmetry to it. So for example, like this piece can be crooked the same angle as this one. You don't need everything to be absolutely crooked from each other. So for example, like this line is still kind of like following this corner, trying to hide these matchboxes that are being rather obnoxious. And yeah, and this is kind of how the general thought process I go through in order to create layout. And when you're taking photos as well, you want to keep some spacing and margin all throughout. And that's the way you have some space, like you can lift up your phone, take photos of it, and then now you're ready to edit it on, you know, Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever program that you like to edit photos in. So the next thing you want to consider is leverage with regard to flat lay styling. First, you want to leverage the height so that the angle of your shot is level at the very top. That way, when you're shooting things, everything will be in the right angle, because the last thing you want is to have things like in a little bit off, like for example, it's closer to the bottom here versus like on the top. So you want to consider that when you're filming it or taking photos of it. You also want to put things up. So, you know, adding like different shadows, like putting the most important things at the very highest point, and all the other stuff can sit at the bottom. You also want to play around with shape variety, because sometimes when you have a stationary suite, sometimes all the cards just look the same. So what you want to do is to leverage what you have, like the envelopes, for example, to make it look more interesting. So for example, this particular suite has an envelope liner. It'll be definitely good for us to leverage what we currently have in order to make it look different. And this one in particular has a vellum wrap, so you'd want to consider like having that some way because it adds texture. But sometimes, for example, for this suite, there's a couple of different cards that have the same like sizing, or like they're too big, and especially because this kind of background is a little bit on the smaller side of things. So you can also consider like only bringing out certain pieces. So for example, maybe we'll have just this piece versus having another part of this blue. I know I love the map, but sometimes it's just a bit too busy. Like if this was on here as well, I'll probably have to add one more piece in here in order to kind of bring it all together. But this is an example of, like, for example, you know, I was telling you about like the odd number thing, is having your design like layout just like this. It just is too, even though there's 5 items, it looks like there's a grid in here. It just doesn't look good. And that's why sometimes it's good for you to like adjust things so that if you're going to have things like off, like not like aligned, like you kind of want to give it like some space. So for example, you don't need to have it in this format. You can move it to the side a little bit and have some gaps. but I really feel like this piece is either too wide or too blue even. So I'm going to take that out, and maybe we'll put it in this format and bring in one more piece, say like I'm bringing in this velvet piece so it kind of matches this background here, and have that as an element. And of course, after you've done all of that, then you can prop things up. But essentially what you want to do as you lay things out is to make sure that there's like breathing room for each piece. So for example, for this one, I'm also going to leverage this envelope shape, even though it's going like horizontal. Now it's like in a vertical orientation, but then that gives it a little bit more room for it to breathe. So once you're settled with everything, then you prop them up. So for this particular piece, I'm going to look at the focus right here, and sometimes I just need to tiptoe a little bit, take a piece. So right now it's actually kind of centered around this piece here in the middle, and that's okay. It's the highest point currently. If I want to make it more focused on this vellum wrap, then the vellum wrap will probably have to be in the center, and maybe we'll change it up later on to kind of show you what that would look like. But this is essentially what I see on my mobile device currently. Like this is the layout essentially of what the invitation would be like. But now there's still like some pieces. It's, I kind of feel like adding a bit of ribbon in here. So when you're having some ribbon, generally you want to steam it so that it's less wrinkly and that you can add it throughout. But first, let's prop things up first. So we're going to add maybe this larger piece on top here and prop it up. And this piece will also need some propping, so you can use cards like I mentioned in order to make this happen, like that. So now it's about the same height, and then this piece, again creating that shadow at the bottom right corner. I think I have one more of these larger coasters. Coasters are a great prop. So you don't have to buy like fancy acrylic pieces, although they are great because they're clear. That's the benefit of using them. But sometimes, like, if you just use what you have at home. So you see these lines here, like sometimes when you have them directly aligned like this, it looks a little bit off. So if you're going to put it aside, you want it to be very intentional. And then now, so we've got this flow going through, but things are not in that grid. So even if we essentially had 4 things right in the middle, we've got this 5th element here at the top. We can add some more life to it horizontal, like this piece here on the bottom. So you can have the edge of the spool, here. You can kind of twirl it around like this, for example. It's one pretty way to add ribbon. You want it like naturally laid out in a portrait format. At least this is what we've been laying it out as. It just looks awkward that it's going to end. So I'm going to add a couple more swirls to this piece and add that into the suite itself. Okay. So if you are turning it, you want to turn it in the same direction, because if you don't, then it looks funny. Kind of like what's happening right now. So you don't want it to have the same size of twirls all throughout. You want a variety. Like you want like some a little bit open, some closed, and then you can kind of finish it off like this, for example. And that way when you photograph it, take a look, it's good enough. This piece is opening up a little bit, and that's when you'll be good to have some kind of tape to hold this down. And that way, like, because when this opens up like this, like the angle doesn't look good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cheat a little bit and do this to the card and twist it down. And now it should be better. There you go. So now it's like pointing downwards versus up, and that way it'll be easier. You see this gap here? It's a little bit smaller than this gap and this gap. So I'm going to move this piece a little bit closer and have that same amount, and move this down a little bit more, and that way it can have like harmony and the amount of spacing throughout. So here we go. I think we're pretty good with this one. Again, leveraging the angles. You can, like, for example, when you're zooming in like this, sometimes you'll notice that it's a little bit crooked. So you can zoom in. Usually like 1.5, 1.8 on your phone or device would usually be a good way to add drama to it. Sometimes when you're doing crops and you're making most of your supplies, you might need to adjust some of the props so that it looks good together. And then like different pieces. So for example, like this one, maybe you'll need to move the ribbon higher up this way, just for this shot. That way you can see a bit of that ribbon. Make sure everything is aligned. Sometimes when you zoom in, that's when you'll notice that some things are crooked. And you don't notice it so much when it's higher up, when it's zoomed out. So yeah, so that's kind of the general sense of how you could leverage what the pieces are. And I'm also going to quickly show you what it would be like if we made it horizontal. So I'm going to just twist it horizontally this way, because like laying things out horizontally is a bit different. And this time around, I want to focus on this vellum piece, as I mentioned, if we wanted to make it like more up and center, which would be the invite. So what we want to do is start off with that piece in the middle, and then kind of design around it. So maybe this time around we'll have, you know, this piece kind of on the side here, kind of playing around with the thought process here. Or no, maybe this one will need to be higher up. So you want this piece essentially to be on the higher side of things. You might need to even add one more lifter to kind of showcase that piece a little bit further. So it's a balance game here. Just making sure everything is balanced. I think this envelope liner might be too busy for this piece, but we can use the calligraphy that we have on the back. So we can add that at the bottom here just to add a bit of drama. Maybe we'll add the ring box here. Ring boxes are a great prop, to be honest with you, especially regard to weddings. They're just a cool little piece to add. This ribbon is already nicely curled, so we can certainly add that piece here. And maybe for this one, we don't need to put the RSVP card. I think it might be just too busy for it. But let me think about it. And that's a process about flat lay styling too. Like, it does take time to go about it, and you want to like especially if you're, you know, doing this on like with a time crunch, you don't want to like rush it. So you like be, you know, patient with yourself, that you can only do say like 1 or 2, and then you can, you know, bring the rest home essentially and play around with it afterwards. Okay, so I'm not too keen about this piece here, so maybe I'll do this piece here instead. Or maybe we'll put this piece over here, because, you know, you need an envelope before you can get into the invite. That's part of that. And then we'll have this piece, the bottom right corner here, or we'll have this piece up here, and we can move this portion up here. So the process can be rather slow, and that's okay. That's like just part of the beauty of creating, right? Like, you don't have to rush it. Create some beauty. Takes time, analysis, like the general concepts I've mentioned, you know, like having the 90-degree angles when you're trying to make things like aligned, and things like that. Maybe we can consider adding some vintage stamps to this piece. I personally love collecting vintage stamps. It's been a really fun hobby, and rather expensive one as well, just because I feel like I've been playing around with too many of these pieces. So like these really cute floral ones might be a good idea. So maybe instead of this one, we can use this piece and add one of these, another floral piece here, like this one. It's kind of got a blue tone to it, so I'm going to do that. I think that's better. That sits better for me, and that way we can use different props. And you don't have to use the exact same props every single time, so you can choose different things. And so that's kind of what I'm thinking. Let's take a look at how it looks on my mobile device or your phone, or whatever you're shooting with. So I want to like zoom out, and that way I can show. So yeah, it looks okay. This one is a little bit further away, so I'm going to move that in a little bit. Yeah, so this is going to be more of a horizontal layout. Sometimes when you have websites, you have like a banner, for example, and you want to show the invitation suite. This is one way you can go about it. And now like the invitation is a lot more front and center versus that other layout there where it was like more like laid out, like you don't really know what's the important piece to do with everything. So yeah, I'm like making some additional adjustments sometimes to kind of like make sure everything is good. Because you want to show some kind of flow, right, and hierarchy to things. Like the whole piece would need to work together in order to create that look you're going for. And then once you're done with all of that, of course, like take your images. Like you can even take some videos of it. So those are good kind of content, and you could go, you know, piece by piece, you know, the different elements to make it all look really good. And what you want to avoid essentially is unflattering lighting. Like, you know, for example, if this whole piece, with the lighting, all the shadows were at the top, you want to avoid that. Like the casts on the side, I chose this blue background, like this pale blue background for this particular suite because I felt like it was part of it. You want to consider that. Crookedness is definitely something that you cannot, or it's harder to change in post, especially if you have lots of different elements. You'll be editing much more than you're doing, so it'd be good to have that. And you also always want to make sure that everything is in focus when you take photos of it when you're doing flat lays, because that's the beauty about flat lays. Like you get to see the content more than all the other people do. Like if you say took a photo of it like sideways like this, or like super far away, you won't get all the details. So the point is that you want to make sure is that your hand is stable, and that way you can get a nice like non-blurred photo. And of course you want to make sure that there's a flow to your pieces. Like I personally design with invitations with a specific color palette because I do want it to look good in a flat lay. And generally the thought process in that is that at least two pieces will have the same color palette. So for example, I've got two of this piece, got two of the ivories to kind of bring that all together. It's okay to have an accent color of some kind, but you don't want it to be the only piece like that's like standing out of everything. You want it to be related. So it is still tonal, so that's okay. That's like part of the overall aesthetic for it. And of course, like when you look at it, you want it to be cohesive altogether. And so in conclusion for this workshop, I'm really happy that you are here. And if you're wondering about where I get all of these materials, I'm going to list everything in my equipment guide that you can download in the links below. And that way you can get those supplies as well. Some of these items are from specific companies that I've loved and trusted all of this time. And I hope you guys enjoyed this session and learned a couple of things from me. And make sure you follow me on Instagram because I always post like some behind the scenes or whenever I'm doing flat lays or designing new invitations. And that way you guys can keep in touch with me. My Instagram handle is @writtenwordcalligraphy. Thank you guys again for joining in our workshop, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye for now.